G'day, watch this.
Professor Anne Twomey, you're Professor of Constitutional Law in the University of Sydney, and you've graciously agreed to speak to us on a legal matter. You're very clearly not expressing your opinions on the policies involved, but you have expertise, as I understand it, in this area. And I wanted to ask you about the possibility of recall elections, that is, elections which are initiated by a petition of the citizens, a certain number of citizens, which results in a recall, as I understand it, of either one member of Parliament, a number, or the whole Parliament. And I'm wondering if you could tell us something about this.
It's a proposal that mostly comes from practice in the United States. And in the United States, it doesn't happen at the national level, but it does happen at the state level in quite a number of states, and certainly at the local level. And in the United States, it tends to be the recall of an individual, either in some jurisdictions because they have committed some kind of wrong, so maybe it's described as being for malfeasance, or some kind of omission in terms of what they've done. But in some jurisdictions it can be for no reason at all, just because you no longer like your member of Congress. If a certain number of people petition in a certain period of time, there's usually a time limit of a number of months, then that can trigger a recall election. It's done different ways in different states, whether you hold the election just to decide whether there's a recall and then hold a second election to replace the person, or sometimes you can do the two things at once. Just hold the one proceeding at which you both A, recall, and if you do recall, then B, elect a person to replace the person being recalled. Most famously, this happened in California, where the governor of California was recalled and replaced by Arnold Schwarzenegger some years back. That got a bit of publicity at the time. It's not very common in the United States at the state level. It's much more common at the local level. And that's probably partially because in the United States, where they do have systems of recall, it's also accompanied by citizens-initiated referenda. So if citizens are angry about a particular decision of a government or a member of the Congress, it's much easier for them to actually try and repeal or change that particular law through a citizens-initiated referendum than it is to actually recall the person. So recall takes very much a second seat, a backward seat, to citizens-initiated referenda in the United States. Recently in the United Kingdom, there was a big kerfuffle, as you might remember, about members' expenses. Members of Parliament allegedly rorting their expenses in order to buy Swedish duck houses for their duck ponds, or to dig out their moats and various other things for their castles. And this caused a deal of outrage in the United Kingdom by the people, and both parties, all three parties at the last election in the United Kingdom proposed to have some kind of a system of recall where the people could recall members of Parliament, but in that case only if they had been found by somebody, and nobody has ever worked out what body that will be, found to have done something wrong, to have been involved in a serious wrongdoing. And since then there have been attempts to get such a law passed, but it's recently gone to a parliamentary committee, and the committee has actually recommended against such a proposal. So at the moment, I think it's in a bit of a stalemate in the United Kingdom, and partly the difficulty was determining what the threshold was before people could recall you. Did you have to be convicted by a court, or should there be some other body that makes that sort of a decision, similar to our Independent Commission Against Corruption? In New South Wales, before the O'Farrell government was elected, opposition leader then, Barry O'Farrell, proposed a system of recall for New South Wales. But in that case, he wasn't proposing the recall of an individual member of Parliament. He was actually proposing really a citizens-initiated election. So the entire House, or indeed possibly, the lower house and half the upper house, would be recalled, and you would have a new full election. Mr. O'Farrell proposed to set up a body of experts to advise upon this, which he did, and they reported some time ago. I think it was probably almost a year ago now, and to the best of my knowledge, the government has never responded to that report. That may be because the committee unexpectedly reported in favour of recall when I think they were supposed to report against it. It's one of those problems that when you set up a panel or a body to investigate something, you normally make sure you know the answer before you appoint them. In this case, they obviously didn't, and the report turned out to be somewhat inconvenient. It's also the case that recall is much more attractive to people in opposition than it is ever to people in government. So again, I think that's probably on the back burner in New South Wales. There are all sorts of difficulties, of course, if you recall, for example, an upper house where you've got proportional representation, or particularly if you're just trying to recall one member, then you'd have to have the whole state vote to replace a member, which wouldn't make sense in proportional representation. And there are difficulties also in doing this because you'd really need a referendum to change the constitution, because it would in effect change the fixed 4-year terms which are entrenched in the constitution, and there's a real issue as to whether the people would want to vote for it in a referendum, or indeed whether you want to spend the money on having a referendum to do it.
One member of the panel dissented, did he not?
Yes, that's right. It was a bit of a mixed verdict. One in favour, one against, and one sort of just teetering in the middle, but slightly in favour of recall. So it wasn't a stunningly unanimous report. It was a little bit on the equivocal side, but it certainly would have given the government food for thought, but it seems to have been taking a rather long time to digest that food.
I was surprised by that report, that it came down in favour of recall elections. Do you see any incompatibility with the Westminster system?
Yes, one of the difficulties with recall, and this is more recall in its traditional American sort of approach, is that you're then looking at, the Americans look at recall in terms of a member of parliament being there solely to represent the views of their constituent as they happen to be at any one time. They don't have that same notion of responsibility. Under our system, there's the notion of responsible government, a member of parliament being a part of a government or a cabinet, having collective responsibility, and therefore having responsibility not only to the voters in their own electorate, but having responsibility to the state as a whole. And that's the difficulty if you're looking at individual recall and say, well, I want to get rid of my member of parliament because he or she didn't do what I particularly wanted on this occasion. That member of parliament has obligations here in New South Wales beyond their own single electorate. They have an obligation to the state as a whole and the people as a whole. And so there are therefore sort of real issues about that, how that fits in with the system of responsible government.
And as I understand it, what you're saying is that in the United States, where you have other forms of direct democracy, in particular citizen-initiated referendums, and I suppose also the existence of grand juries which can do their own investigations without the state having to authorise them to do it, that this militates against frequent use of recalls.
Yes, it does. And so one issue here would be if you didn't have those other sorts of factors at play, would every disgruntled person therefore initiate recall petitions, frequently disrupting government? There are a lot of problems with recalls, and may as well go through a few of them. One is the influence of money. In the United States, for example, you can simply buy signatures for your petition. You just employ a signature gathering company and they guarantee that they can get signatures for any proposition that you want, so long as you can pay enough. So last time I spoke to people there, the going rate was about $2.50 per signature, but if you have sufficient amount of money, X million dollars, you can buy, in the United States, you can buy in a state a citizens initiated referendum or a recall purely through having enough money. Right, so that's obviously an issue in Australia. In New South Wales, if a government could be overturned by an entire new election initiated by petitions, wouldn't there therefore be a risk that any sector of the community awash with money, big mining companies, pharmaceutical companies, gambling interests, could they not buy the opportunity of a new election if they put enough money into it? That's something that you really, really want to avoid. The other problem with recall elections is that they're often used politically to undermine a government. So even if you're not actually likely to achieve a recall, the mere fact that you're out there petitioning can completely disrupt government. It forces government to put money into campaigning to oppose the recall. It chews up the government's money that it can use at the next election. It distracts them from governing, and it causes general instability because, of course, you've got the press and the media speculating as to whether the government's going to fall or there'll be an election at a particular time. So there are genuine problems with the whole notion of recall elections. And the other point in the end is that when we elect a government every 4 years, then we, the people, also need to take responsibility for our vote. We shouldn't be able to turn around and say, okay, I made a mistake, I don't like them anymore, I want to change my mind. We, the people, the voters, need to take responsibility for what they do, need to know that there's a fixed term in which the government that they elect can govern, and to give the government the freedom to govern in that term. If a government is constantly under pressure to always do things that are politically popular through that term in order to avoid a recall election, then that is a government that will not govern well, because any government to govern well has to have the capability and the preparedness to make unpopular decisions in the long term where it's necessary for them to do that. So if you had the constant threat of recall, you undermine the capacities of governments to govern well in the interests of the state, where doing so involves doing something that's inherently unpopular.
A few years ago, in a tract for Australia as a constitutional monarchy, I suggested that one constitutional reform which might overcome the problem of 1975, because once the reserve powers are used, to an extent they're eaten up. It's very difficult to use them again. And I suggested that rather, if we'd had a right of recall then, the opposition would have concentrated on trying to raise a petition rather than refusing supply or delaying supply, which is a much more questionable thing to do.
It certainly has, there are some benefits obviously to recall, and one of them is a funnel to allow an outlet for anger, steam, frustration with the government. So it does direct attention and allow that to be directed. The difficulty though is being able to manage it in such a way that it's only genuine public concern about a government that leads to recall, and it's not manipulated by political parties simply for their own ends when they've just lost an election by a very small amount, trying to get another election to have a second go, or big moneyed interests fermenting trouble and causing difficulties. Sometimes I think also politicians can be just a little bit too much in a hurry. Like voters who need to take responsibility for their own voting choices, I suspect that in many cases politicians would be better off being constructive and waiting for the next election and preparing policies and putting forward a positive message about what they will achieve, rather than spending an entire term trying to cut down a government. I suspect that the focus on the positive and proving that an opposition would be a good government is probably a better approach.
Professor Twomey, thank you very much for sharing your very impressive experience and understanding of the issue of recall elections. Thank you.
Thank you.